Hi everyone. What I would like to talk to you about today is how to be an anti-racist educator. I'll begin by saying I'm a white male, approximately early 40s, and I've been teaching in the Ontario education system for about 16 years now. Um, I've noticed, as we've all noticed, I guess, in recent times, I'm recording this in late June of 2020. So one of the reasons this is uh, even being recorded is because of the climate that we're in right now, and I feel that it's imperative for educators to have a pretty good understanding of what it means to be an anti-racist educator, because oftentimes when you talk about anti-racism, or you just talk about racism in the education system, you get crickets. Nobody wants to talk about it because it's uncomfortable. I've over the last few years have gotten over that discomfort phase. Um, I've done my readings. I've put my work into in understanding equity work, and I feel like I'm uh, as ready as ever to kind of give a mini lesson on this. So what I'm going to be providing you is I'm going to give you a lot of information. If you know, if at any point you want to pause to look at the information I have on the screen, feel free to do so because I might go through it rather, I wouldn't say fast, but just for expediency. I don't want this to be a long video. I want this to be a video that will be helpful for you. Because these are the things that I've talked about a lot with other educators, other educators that are working towards being an anti-racist educator. These are things that I've gleaned from books and from sitting in meetings and sitting in conferences and webinars and all the things that have made me a better anti-racist educator. Um, I won't be able to talk about everything, but I'll be able to point you down a path of being more aware of this topic. Okay, so let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is to be an anti-racist educator, you need to understand that racism and anti-racism sit on a continuum. That you actively work one way or the other every time you step in front of your class. Um, I could I could do or say something that would be considered racist. That doesn't make me a bad person. That just makes me somebody who made a mistake and needs to learn. Or I could be actively working towards anti-racism and checking myself and regulating myself and thinking about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Um, but the goal is to strive for anti-racism behavior, while recognizing that no one's perfect. Is you know Try to be more on that side of the spectrum, but also know that you may have slip ups because we all have slip ups because we live in a white supremacist society where these things just are ingrained in our everyday life. Which, and I'll talk about a bunch of things later in the video that kind of get to that. So these are questions that you should ask yourself as an educator when it comes to anti-racism and its impacts within your classroom. Do I know enough about racism to speak to students in my class who might need guidance about navigating issues related to race? Do I care about the experiences and struggles of all students in my class or just some of the students? How does my lack of knowledge about racism impact my lessons? Do I frame my questions in class or in my lessons that focus only on certain groups? Does the material in my class represent a diverse group of people in my field of study? Why or why not? Is my classroom inviting and welcoming to everyone? How do my students see me? Am I someone they can talk to, or someone they think will not understand them? And how has white privilege impacted how I teach? These are questions that you should always be asking yourself. Now, you can't ask them all at the same time, but these are things that you should be asking yourselves on a weekly or a monthly basis. How are these things permeating into my education, into my lessons, and how do I deliver those lessons? This is an image that I have seen a lot in presentations, and you can easily find it online. But the whole idea of this this image is to recognize that we have to go through certain zones to really get towards becoming an anti-racist. There is a fear zone, a learning zone, and a growth zone. I would consider myself hopefully in the growth zone. I could still be in the learning zone. Um, I know I've gotten over the fear zone, and I know a lot of people exist in that fear zone. It's a small circle, but a lot of people still exist in it. How can white educators learn about anti-racism? We have to talk. As a white educator, I've been fortunate being around black educators, the few that are in the system. Um, it's just systemically, there's just very few teachers who are black, indigenous, or people of color. So I've been fortunate to be able to talk to them about these issues because they have the credentials to talk about it. They have the background, and they felt comfortable talking about it. Uh, our my background kind of invited me to a lot of tables where I could just have conversations um, with black educators. Um, but these are I need to be talking to white educators about these things, and other white educators need to be talking about other white educators about this. Um, the uh, the caveat to this is don't assume that black people want to talk about this or are capable of talking about this. Some people, that live this trauma, living in a systemic, an oppressively systemic system, may not be ready to talk about it or able to talk about it. They may be dealing with their own issues that come with this. So we need to learn independently. White people created this problem. White people should be fixing this problem. We should not be asking people of color to help us understand this when it's pretty easy to understand it once you put the work in. So I've just got a couple of quotes here from Ibram Kendi from his book How to Be an Anti-Racist. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. What's the difference? One endorses either the idea of a racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. Another quote: What's the problem with being not racist? It is a claim that signifies neutrality. I am not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. But there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti racist. And the final quote: One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti racist. There is no in between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. And all three of those quotes get to the heart of what you have to try to do as an anti racist educator is you have to get to the work of dealing with racial inequities and helping others understand the systems that have been built and are still around us that lead to those inequities. So I'm just going to go over some excuses that I hear that I've heard in my experience as a teacher, and to give you an idea of a translation and what the remedies are for those excuses that people give. So the first one is I don't know where to start, which means I'm not willing to care enough to look into it. Which also means that as a remedy, we should be reflecting on behavior and attitudes to consider whose lives you value. If you truly cared about kids in your class, you would you would know where to start. Which means that you research, you read, you watch, you listen, you do all the things. If you got a university degree, you had to read, listen, and watch. So these are things that we need to be doing. I don't have time to read anything about this right now, is an excuse I hear a lot, which means I don't want to invest in learning how to better serve students in my class. And what we need to do, once again, is read. Everybody should be reading on how to eliminate these uh, problems. And if you don't have time to read, then you make time. There is no excuse for not having time as an educator. If you've got 2 months off in the summer, pick up a book. If you've got 2 weeks off at Christmas, you pick up a book. If you've got March break, pick up a book. If you don't have time to read a book, listen to an audiobook, watch a film, read an essay, read something short, read something long. There are poems on this that you can read. That we have to continue um, learning. It's a lifelong journey, and for teachers who say that they don't have time, they're kind of insulting the teachers that do have time, because we make time for our students. Um, and one of my big things that I've always been thinking about as an educator is, if you stop reading as an educator, once you graduate university, get your teaching degree, and then get into teaching, and then you stop learning, then you're essentially a hypocrite. You're not doing what you're telling your students to do, because the students could say the same thing. It's like, well, I don't need to do anything now. I'm done. I've got a 50 in my class. I just have to pass. I don't need to learn anymore. So we can't accept that excuse. Another excuse is, I don't feel comfortable talking about this, or I don't want to say anything wrong, which really means I exert my privilege not to invest time to learn about something that scares me but helps those around me. It's okay to learn. Be okay with your own learning. Make mistakes. Admit when you make them and move on. Um, the best conversations that you have are uncomfortable conversations, because you get to the crux of the issue. This is too complicated for me to understand is translated into, despite having a degree, I'm unable to learn new things, which we all know is not true. So anyone can understand this if you care enough to put the work into it. You don't need to have a degree to understand this stuff. I've talked to my 7-year-old daughter about this. People will understand it. My daughter understands it. Um, I had to talk to her a lot more about it, but she gets it. So if a 7-year-old could get it, we can get it. That just means that we have to be ready to deal with complicated terms and complicated ideas. Another excuse is, I always treat my students with respect, which means I respect the students I understand and not the ones I don't. When you say that you respect all students, you're really just hoping that you respect all of your students, and the students respect you back. Don't assume that every student feels respected by how you act and what you say, because you may say something that goes against how they feel. This doesn't affect my students or my classroom, which means I don't want to see how this impacts my students and my classroom. Wh- Whether you're a Black, Indigenous, or a person of color in your class or not, or whether you have a Black, Indigenous, or person of color in your class or not, this affects everyone. Um, one of the things I've made countless arguments for is that we don't need to be talking uh, to marginalized students about this. We need to be talking to white students about this, and we need to be talking to them a lot, because those are the kids that are going to go out into the world and have a preconceived notion of, well, I can't talk about this because I did talk about it in high school. If we talk about these things in high school amongst each other as educators, and we feel comfortable talking to our students about this, then the students will feel comfortable talking about this, and then that will kind of break down the system of denial that we've created in our education system. Uh, can't you just tell me what I should say, think, or do? I've heard this multiple times, and what it really means is, I don't really want to learn. Just tell me what to do or say, that it gives a perception that I care. We don't need performative allies in this work. We don't need people who say that they're going to do something but they just want to be told what to say. You have to be invested in it. You have to want to learn about this information to actually do something about it, and not just be told what to do. Because when you're just told what to do, then you don't really believe it. Um, you can, if you want to pause just to look at this list. Um, this is a good list to really question ways that you might be supporting white supremacy. So I'll just go through a couple. If you ask, why do we call it white supremacy? And you want to call it something else, white supremacy is white supremacy. If you think your colleagues of color might be too difficult when they mention oppression in your school, that's an example of supporting white supremacy. If you get angry when someone asks you to acknowledge your own white privilege, that's an example of white supremacy. If you simply don't think about microaggressions, that's white supremacy. So there's lots of examples of white supremacy that if you don't want to talk about it and if you don't want to acknowledge it, where you're basically supporting it, you're holding the columns up of white supremacy. Okay, so I just want to go through a couple of terms. Once again, you can pause this if you want to look at the terms in a little bit more detail. But these are terms that you need to know to be able to have conversations about anti-racism education. So the first one is BIPOC, which just means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's meant to unite the people who have been marginalized because they've all felt some level of injustice. We need to know this because language and terms change. This is a term that it will probably be more commonly used in the future because it represents more people and more people that are kind of unified and having a voice. Um, White supremacy. So the idea of white supremacy is not, it's people um, in everyday situations that don't do anything because it benefits them. It's self-interest. It's not just people in clan robes and hoods and the overt racists. Yeah, that's white supremacy, but that's white supremacy on the surface. The white supremacy that's more insidious is the ones that are more underlying. White space is something that we should be considering a lot more because, especially as educators, what does your space look like? What does your school look like? Is your school dominated with images of white, people from the past who are white? Do you go into um, certain classrooms or just rooms and you can tell that it's a white space? It's a white space only because we know it's not a black space. If you walk into a black space as a white person, you feel different. You know that it's not your space. Um, and most education systems, most schools, most businesses are white spaces, and they don't feel comfortable to black people because they feel like that it's off limits, that it's the white space. It's something that if you get a chance to look more into, it's a very incredible journey to learn about white space and what white space means. This is an example of what I was talking about before with overt white supremacy and covert white supremacy. The ones that we all know are up at the top, and then in the covert section, these are all things that we don't talk about, but we all know that are things that exist, things that we have to deal with. Um, saying it's just a joke, or denying white privilege, or saying that you're an ally and you're not an ally, um, uh, saying this is post-racial stuff, um, or white savior complex. These are all things that are the the underlying components of white supremacy. White privilege, which hopefully people have heard this term before, and we have to be more comfortable talking about it. Which is the understanding that there are just advantages to being white. There are privileges. There are privileges to being a man. There are privileges to being, um, uh, wealthy, or growing up in a good home, growing up with two parents. Like those are all privileges. Those are all advantages. We have to recognize that we have those advantages, so that we can actually do something with those privileges. Um, being productive with your privilege is going to help everybody. White fragility is the idea that when you feel uncomfortable talking about your whiteness, you try to make yourself the victim rather than understanding that Black, Indigenous people of color have been a victim. So don't cry, don't get the feels when you talk about this, because then that just exposes your white fragility. When you make an error, apologize and move on, or recognize the things that you need to recognize and then move on. Don't try to turn yourself into the victim. Microaggressions are small incidences, or as people have told me before, they're death by 1,000 cuts. You have to recognize that your best practices are going to uh, help everyone around you. That it's not just a joke. If you make something, if you make a joke and it's at the expense of somebody because you want to laugh, then you're essentially committing a microaggression against that person. You can look at this, if you want to pause here. I won't go into too much detail of it, but it gives you a little bit more information about what white fragility is and how we have to uh, tackle it and confront white fragility. This is uh, an image that talks about racial microaggressions and how they perpetuate inequity. Um, if you say to somebody, you're so articulate," or you say, "Where are you born?" Those are microaggressions. Those are things that you're saying because you want to um, uh, either denigrate somebody or you want to build yourself up. So in the middle, there's also actions. So when you're the target, what should you do about microaggressions? When you're a bystander, what should you do about a microaggression? When you're the microaggressor, what should you be doing in order to not do that again? So if you want to pause and look at this as well, you could do that. All right, intersectionality. Continue with the terms. Intersectionality is looking at um, how all the categorizations in our society, such as race, class, and gender, apply to given groups and individuals, and it gives them an overlapping and independent system of discrimination or disadvantage. So, if you are a Black woman who is disabled, you you are you have multiple intersections of disadvantages. So what society deems as disadvantages. If you are a rich white male, you have incredible privilege. So we need to recognize these things. We need to recognize that not everybody is on the same footing, that we are all kind of struggling with um, uh, advantages and disadvantages. Systemic oppression is the intentional disadvantaging of groups of people based on their identity while advantaging members of the dominant group. So, as a white man, systemic oppression works really well for me. Um, should it? No. It should be working well for everyone. So, we need to look at our surroundings and understanding how systemic oppression it creates the system so that we understand how the system works, so that we can understand how to remedy the problems that systemic oppression has caused. Marginalization is the treatment of a person, group, or concept as insignificant or peripheral. So, going back to intersectionality, you have people who are marginalized because they fit outside of the normal or the privileged class. And we have these students in our class, and we need to recognize their journeys so that we can empathize with them a little bit more. So this is an example of intersectionality. Once again, if you want to pause to look at the video or to look at the screen, you can. But um, you know, if you look at the privileges and the oppressions, um, and try to identify yourself on this, you'll probably be able to get a better understanding of what intersectionality means. Because um, as a white male, um, I'm in that privileged side, but I grew up poor. So I was working class poor. So I had oppression, but I was able to move outside of that oppression. I was able to shift from working class poor to middle class, um, way better off than I was when I was a kid. Um, some privileges you can move in and out of, other privileges you can't. And we need to recognize that there are levels of oppression that people deal with every day that they can't escape. Institutional racism, very similar to systemic depression, is the racial bias, the explicit attitudes of individuals by the existence of systematic policies or laws and practices that work against a group of people. So, voter suppression, um, certain laws and policies that are put in place. Um, uh, Carding. These are all things that just add to this institutional racism that's been perpetuated in our society. Performative ally or slacktivism is the idea of being for a cause, but not really actually doing anything to combat any form of oppression. So if you share and you donate content, those are good things to do. But people in positions of power need to use that power to actually evoke change. So me making this video is a good example of doing something other than just saying, yeah, we should do something about this, or post it on social media, because those are all good things. But what change is actually done with it? So being performative means that you're saying the good things, but you're not actually doing the good things. Implicit bias is also something that I don't think a lot of people think about, but these are attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding that are unconscious. So we do these things without actually knowing why we're doing these things or how we're doing these things. So we need to constantly reevaluate what we do and what we say. Every time we engage, we have to reflect on our actions. So this is an image that kind of goes and supports the concept of not being a performative ally. Because when somebody's in trouble, you don't get on your phone and say, "Oh, that's," or record somebody who's being attacked. We need to do something. So in this image, everybody is on their phones saying, this is very bad, but not one single person has got out of there and tried to help them or call the police, um, or call somebody that's going to help. So that's a performative ally. It's one thing to post it on social media. It's another thing to actually show some altruism and get out and try to make a change. The last term is the politics of respectability or respectability politics, which we all do. It's the moralistic discourse where we want to be perceived a certain way. So as an educator, I want to look professional. I don't wear sandals and shorts and um, you know um, um, a regular T-shirt. I would want to wear dress pants. I'd want to wear dress shoes. I'd want to wear a button shirt. That's respectability politics. I have to be perceived as a teacher in order to be respected as a teacher. Um, and we hold those things a little bit more so with how people of color and black and indigenous people. So they have to look a certain way for them to receive our respect. Um, so black women straighten their hair, black men straighten their hair, and they have to dress a certain way and talk a certain way because we have to um, perceive them as respectable in order to do that. Because if you listen to hip hop, well, geez, you can't be we can't respect you because you listen to hip hop. Um, so this idea of being professional is something that we need to recognize, that we are playing into the concept of judging a person, um, and their abilities on their outward appearance, rather than actually just judging them on their capabilities and their performance. Um, Now, I just wanted to talk about this image because I see this image a lot, and I got this from a university website, University of North Carolina, and they talk about racial equity, and talking about equality and equity. So equity meaning sameness, which doesn't benefit, it only benefits one person in this image, and then equity, which is fairness, which does benefit all three. But the one thing that both images are not tackling is, why is that fence there in the first place? Who put that fence there, and why did they put it there? And why is that fence not torn down so that everybody can enjoy? So we need to start looking at, if you're looking at racial equity, that's great, but we need to understand how the systems are in place that are holding people at a disadvantage. So I'm just going to go through some books, some resources that you can at any point just pause and write these down if you want, or look them up. These are great resources. These are things that I've used to better my understanding of anti-racism education. Um, so you want to talk about race, white fragility, how to be an anti-racist, me and white supremacy, policing black lives, the skin we're in, stamped from the beginning, the new Jim Crow, white rage, why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, and between the world and me are all great books to use. Um, if you're not a reader, get an audio book, listen to it. I've almost all of these I've read with an audiobook, and I take notes. Um, you will not be disappointed by any of these resources. In the next list here are shorter readings. So these are essays and government resources. Once again, pause it and write any of them down if you want. But these are also great resources to learn about anti-racism education in a shorter form. So some are just news articles that really get to learning about this stuff a little bit more. If you're a podcast person, these are a list of podcasts that you can subscribe to and listen to, and I guarantee you wouldn't be disappointed with any of them. Films and documentaries. These are great films. So there's a couple of CBC documentaries. So I'm in Canada, and these are great documentaries that speak to racism in Canada. There are some TED Talks that are very, very good. Um, and I'm a big film person. So one of the films that has uh, kind of urged me to do more in anti-racism education is Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th, which talks about a whole host of issues, but it's a great history lesson in systemic oppression. Um, and the other two films are great to learn about these issues. There's lots of other resources and films and documentaries you could watch as well to learn about this. Especially from black uh, directors and producers and writers that that kind of explore a world that most white people uh, don't or can't relate to. If you are on social media, I use Twitter. So these are the people that I follow on Twitter, because I find them to be incredibly insightful and incredibly helpful in helping me understand the history of racism, the history of oppression, and what we can be doing, what our next steps are, especially as white educators, what we should be doing to help the cause. Now, subject integration. Um, These are I've posted these. These are articles, so you could pause and type these in, and you would get articles related to the subjects. But one thing we should be thinking about, yeah, as educators is how can we integrate this into lessons and courses. I've integrated anti-racism education into my history classes, into my media classes, and into my English classes. These are things that we could be doing in geography, in science, math, drama, history, phys ed, sociology, French. I'm sure I'm missing a couple of other subjects. But these are all things that we should be talking about. And if you don't know how to talk about them, talk to peers, talk to um, other educators. Look up on things online. Like if you're looking at geography, you can be talking about redlining, the concept of redlining. History is an easy one, I think, but for phys ed, you could be talking about stereotypes and physical education and the myths and the stereotypes that exist for black athletes in sports. In French class, you could be talking about colonialism and how France it helped build this concept of oppression. Why certain African countries speak French is stuff that we could be looking at a little bit further into. Uh, And I won't go. I won't read through all the stuff that's on this screen. You can pause if you want to look at these questions in more detail. But what I really want to focus on is the concept of performative allyship, and I want to centralize on this because if when you're dealing with overt racism, you can spot it, and it's easy to spot, and you know how to deal with overt racism. You know you can challenge overt racism. Performative allies I would consider more dangerous because they're giving the perception that they care when they don't. Um, because if they are answering no to any of these, uh, um, or sorry, yes to any of these questions, you have to really think about whether you're actually being an ally or whether you're just making it look like you're an ally. Performative allies, like I said, I would consider to be more dangerous because they give off the perception that they care, but they don't really care. They just want people to think that they care. Um, and those, the people that do that are not helping, fix anything. They're just doing it for the likes and for the acknowledgement. So I'm pretty heavy-handed with these films. I don't show these films in my class, um, and I know these are films that can be used in a range of courses, in a range of levels. And the reason I don't is because these are examples of white savior films, where a black person can only succeed with the assistance of a white person. And that's a very problematic trope to enter into and to subscribe to as an educator. The belief that only with the help of white people are black people going to be successful, um, and that's not the story, and that's not the concept we should be contributing and adding to in the education system. So instead of using those films, use these films or these TV series. I've used Black Panther. I could use Black Panther, in a lot of my English courses to talk about a lot of different things. But if you're teaching a history class, you could be using some of these. If you're teaching sociology, you could be using some of these. But these are films about the Black experience that don't rely on white people saving the day, because that in and of itself is very problematic. These are probably lesser known, with the exception of Black Panther, but these are films that we should be using and showing to kids and students to give them a better understanding of history and of modern experiences, but also giving them an alternative view of what it means to be black. So these are things that I usually go, when I hear them. and I won't go into too much detail on them, but basically each one of the things on the left is something that somebody's going to say, and the things on the right are the remedies to them. So when somebody says, I'm not racist, tell them that they should be aiming to be anti-racist rather than saying that they're not racist. If somebody says they can't be racist because they're a good person, maybe let them know that good people make mistakes. So you can be a good person and be racist, and you can be a bad person and be anti-racist. Because we all have bias, we all make mistakes, but we all have good intentions. So rather than saying that you can't be one because you're the other, doesn't mean that they are mutually exclusive. When people say that they don't see color, they're really just trying to avoid the reality, and that's not going to help anybody. It's not going to help anybody in your class. It's not going to help your peers. So we need to see color. We need to recognize it, and we need to celebrate differences rather than trying to avoid seeing the differences. When somebody says I've had struggles too, and basically trying to play the woe is me card, um, really have to get them to define what struggle means for them. Because I grew up poor, um, and once I went to university and became a teacher, I wasn't poor anymore. So I fixed my problem. I fixed my struggle. Living, being a black person, living every day is a constant struggle, and it's never going to go away until we start working towards anti-racism education. So the struggle means something different in that respect. So we need to educate people into really defining what a struggle means. When somebody says that's not my problem, um, if they're not working to be a part of the solution, then they are part of the problem, and they need to recognize that. And when people say, if uh, you know, if black people or indigenous people just worked harder, then they wouldn't have this problem. This is something going back to, my goodness, this goes back to W.B. Du Bois. This goes back to Booker T. Washington, um, Frederick Douglass. Martin Luther King spoke on this, which is the bootstraps analogy. If they just pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, then they wouldn't have these problems. But it's hard to pull yourself up by your bootstraps if your laces have been removed. And systemic injustice is the removal of the laces. You can't do the work if you are missing a piece of your equipment. So we need to recognize that it's not about working harder. It's about recognizing that the system is set up against them, so that they, even though they can work, they have to work harder. They shouldn't have to work as hard or harder than anybody else to achieve the same goal. So, what are we going to be doing to be an anti-racist educator? So, I'm going to talk about what I'm doing to be an anti-racist educator, and I'll preface by saying I'm trying to do better every day. I'm not doing great things. There are other educators that are doing amazing things. I'm doing what I can with where I'm at right now. So the first thing is to implement change in my classroom. I've been trying to do that the last 5 years with my history classes, with my English classes, and I've been trying to strive every day to do something better in my class that is working towards an anti-racism lens. I try to educate staff who are not striving for anti-oppressive education and calling them out if they're not doing it. That's usually not the very popular opinion. I'm 16 years into teaching. I don't really care too much about people's feelings, if I hurt people's feelings anymore, especially when they need to hear something that I need to tell them. But that's also my privilege as a white man. I can do that, and usually not get too much blowback off of that. I also want to challenge administrators who are not promoting anti-racist education to do more. Um, this is a multi-layered hierarchy of systemic oppression. It goes from the teachers to the administrators to superintendents to the board. In any organization, you are going to have people who don't want to do the work, and if one person doesn't want to do it, it makes it so much harder to do the work overall. So my goal is to challenge administrators, and I encourage anybody else to challenge administrators in not promoting this work, especially in the climate that we're at. I think you're going to have support in specific areas where support did not exist before, and hopefully it'll be easier. We should be also encouraging, and I'm also encouraging other educators to implement anti-oppressive education in their classrooms, and wanting to help them. So if they don't know how to do it, I want to sit down and try and help them do it, even if I don't know anything about the subject. In a math class, uh, you know, I don't know much about math, but I know that this is stuff that can be taught easily in a math class. Talking about statistics of police brutality, um, looking at statistics of people living. Where do white people live? Where do black people live? How did those systems get set up? What does that mean? What's the average income for a black family living in a certain city versus a white family in a certain city? There's lots of things that we could be doing in different subject areas to be dealing with this and talking about it a little bit more. Uh, in my experience, I've lost some relationship because I've been fairly honest with people about some shortcomings that they have towards anti-racism education. And I've been totally fine with that. I would say probably 10 years ago, I would have been more concerned about losing friendships, but now I'm totally fine if I lose a friendship and people don't want to hear what I have to say. Then they were really never my friend in the first place, and they never really were somebody that I should have ever felt close to in the first place. The one thing that I have gotten out of this is that I've gained a lot of new friendships with people that I know are doing the same work that I'm doing, and um, and that's okay with me. I'd rather be working with people that are trying to do good things than people who are trying to avoid doing good things, because it makes them feel uncomfortable. So just be aware that there's going to be some flux in between who will listen to you, who won't listen to you, and who won't want to talk to you anymore, and who will want to talk to you after that. Ultimately, for me, I want to strive to be less racist and more anti-racist every day. Um, I have a biracial family. Um, and you know, one of the tropes is that, well, if I'm in a biracial family, I can't be racist, which is not true. I've made jokes thinking that they were funny to make me laugh, but at the expense of others that I look back on now, and I think I'm very regretful of saying and doing those things. So every day I want to try to do more and more to become more anti-racist and less racist. Yeah, but once again, going back to the beginning of this is a continuum. You try to do your best every day, and if you lapse, you just try and do better the next day, and ultimately be the change that you want to see. So if you are for being an anti-racist educator, then do things that are going to be considered anti-racist, not just saying but doing. So I encourage you to get out and to uh, do things that are going to make a positive change in your education practice, so that it's going to be a benefit to the students in your classroom. Um, so that's all I had. Hopefully, this wasn't too much information for you. But the big thing that I want to emphasize is that this is something that's going to benefit everybody in your class. It's going to benefit all the people on your staff, and it's going to benefit you. So try to continue to do things that are giving you a better perspective on anti-racism education, and try to strive for um, being a better teacher every day. Okay, so thanks for listening, and have a good day.